Imagine marrying the love of your life and instead of receiving support, being surrounded by judgmental looks, cruel accusations and comments that you are only after money. This was Emma Caldwell's reality when she joined millionaire Matthew Bennett, but no one knew the real reason she was hiding behind this relationship. A shocking and emotional revelation that will completely change what everyone thinks about her. Want to know what she kept secret for so long? Get ready for a story full of twists, sacrifices and a truth no one saw coming. Stay until the end to find out what really happened, and if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe now. This helps us keep bringing amazing stories like this to you. The sky above Manhattan was gray, mirroring the suffocating weight that had settled over Emma Caldwell. Just weeks after her wedding to the wealthy real estate mogul Matthew Bennett, whispers had grown into a deafening roar. To everyone around her, she was no longer Emma, the hardworking woman who had once lived paycheck to paycheck. No, in their eyes she had transformed into the ultimate cliché, a gold digger. As Emma sat by the window in their luxury penthouse, she could still hear the echoes of the gossip, the sly comments exchanged at her wedding reception. Even that day, the happiest day of her life, had been poisoned by judgmental stares and smirks hidden behind champagne glasses. She could still feel the cold glares from Matthew's family, the way his mother, Evelyn, had coldly assessed her dress as if calculating its price tag rather than appreciating its beauty. Emma's thoughts flashed back to the tight, disapproving smile Evelyn had worn when they exchanged vows, a smile that never reached her eyes. A woman like her, she only wants one thing, Evelyn had whispered to her sister, just loud enough for Emma to overhear. It wasn't just family either. Friends, acquaintances, and even strangers online had formed their own narrative. Social media was flooded with posts and comments about the girl who married up, who knew exactly what she was doing. The judgment was brutal and constant, like daggers cutting into her every time she scrolled through her phone. She's nothing but a gold digger. Everyone knows it, one of the posts read, accumulating hundreds of likes and even more malicious replies. Emma tossed her phone aside, overwhelmed. The weight of the accusations wasn't just heavy, it was crushing. The irony was almost too much to bear. No one knew the truth about her and Matthew's relationship, not even their closest friends. They all saw the glamorous, wealthy power couple in the headlines, but they knew nothing of the nights Matthew had sobbed in her arms, vulnerable and broken from the trauma of his past. No one knew how hard it had been for them to build a life together in the shadows of his success, nor did they care. That afternoon, Matthew returned home from work. The sound of the penthouse door closing softly brought Emma back to reality. He was always careful now, cautious with her, as if afraid his mere presence might worsen the storm surrounding them. She watched him cross the room, his broad shoulders slightly slumped under the weight of responsibilities few could fathom. "Emma?" he called softly, unsure of what version of her he might find. The bright, smiling Emma he married, or the one who had become a prisoner to the accusations thrown at her. Emma turned to face him, her eyes shadowed with the exhaustion of defending herself against a world she could no longer fight. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice carrying the weariness of a battle she hadn't asked for but was forced to fight. Matthew walked over and knelt in front of her, his eyes full of concern. "They don't matter. None of them matter, Em." But the problem was, they did. Their words had burrowed deep into Emma's mind, infecting even the quietest corners of her thoughts. She wished she could believe him, but how could she when the world saw her as nothing more than a leech? A woman who had married a man for his bank account, not for love. "Do you believe them?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Do you believe I married you for money?" Matthew's face hardened. His hands gently cupped her cheeks, his touch tender yet firm. "How could you even ask that? You know I don't. We built this together. You were with me before all of this, before the success, before the money." She did know deep down. She knew that when they first met, Matthew wasn't the man the world saw today. He wasn't the high-profile CEO who graced magazine covers, attending gala events in custom-made suits. No, back then he was just Matt, a man rebuilding his life after losing everything in a devastating bankruptcy. Back then he was a man who needed someone to believe in him. But the world didn't know that. Later that evening, as Matthew showered, Emma wandered through their penthouse, her fingers grazing the cold marble countertops and the sleek, modern furniture that screamed wealth and opulence. It felt like a museum to her, an exhibit where she didn't quite belong. Every inch of their home was a reminder of what people thought she had sought in this marriage: riches, luxury, status. But what none of them knew was how little this material life mattered to her. The truth was something that Emma had never spoken out loud, not even to Matthew. She had married him because she loved him, yes, but also because she knew something that no one else did. something far more important than wealth. Emma knew that Matthew was deeply broken, emotionally scarred in ways that no amount of money could fix. He carried wounds that no one could see, and Emma had taken it upon herself to be the one to heal them. But that came at a cost. With Matthew's success came a new life, one where people judged Emma not for who she was, but for what she represented. A woman who had climbed the social ladder by marrying into money. They didn't care that she had spent years supporting him emotionally, through the darkest days of his life. All they saw was the end result. The night dragged on. After dinner, Emma found herself once again sitting by the window, staring at the lights of the city that never slept. The thought of walking away had crossed her mind more than once recently. It would be easier, wouldn't it? If she left, the whispers would eventually fade. She could go back to her old life, away from the public eye. But deep down, Emma knew she wouldn't leave. She couldn't. Because even though Matthew's wealth was the shield the world saw behind it, he was just a man who loved her, truly deeply. And she loved him in return. That was a truth no amount of gossip could destroy. Still, the weight of it all was almost unbearable. As she sat there, lost in thought, Matthew came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her shoulders, pulling her into his chest. "We'll get through this," he murmured into her hair. "Together." Emma leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. For a moment, the noise of the outside world faded, and it was just the two of them again like it had been in the beginning. But as the city lights twinkled below, Emma couldn't help but wonder how long they could hold out against a world determined to see her as the villain in a story they knew nothing about. It was a rainy afternoon in the fall of 2016, and Emma Caldwell sat in the bustling waiting room of St. Vincent's Hospital. She wasn't there for herself but to accompany her best friend, Lily, who had been injured during a minor car accident earlier that week. The fluorescent lights above flickers every so often, casting a sterile glow over the dull beige walls, and the air smelled of disinfectant and faint anxiety. Emma could feel the tension in her shoulders as she flipped aimlessly through an old magazine, waiting for the nurse to call Lily's name. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed him. He was sitting 2 chairs over, staring at the floor as if the weight of the world was crushing him from all sides. His clothes were rumpled, his dark hair slightly disheveled, and there was a deep sadness in his eyes. He looked completely out of place in his worn, expensive suit, like a man who had once been someone important but had fallen on hard times. Emma's initial reaction was one of empathy. Something about the way his hands trembled slightly as they clutched a coffee cup tugged at her heart. The receptionist called out a name and he jolted as if brought out of a trance. "Matthew Bennett," she announced. Emma blinked in surprise. The Matthew Bennett? The real estate entrepreneur who had made headlines for one of the biggest bankruptcies in the last decade? She had read about him, of course. He had been a rising star in New York's business world before losing everything in a series of high-profile deals that had gone terribly wrong. It wasn't just his money that had disappeared. His reputation, his status, and his career had all crumbled too. Matthew stood up and approached the receptionist's desk, his shoulders slumped, looking nothing like the confident businessman from the articles. As he spoke to the woman behind the counter, Emma could see the exhaustion in his movements. She tried to turn her attention back to the magazine in her hands, but something about him stuck with her. She couldn't explain it, but there was a familiarity in his brokenness, something she recognized from her own struggles, from the countless times she had felt the world crumbling around her with no one to turn to. Moments later, Matthew returned to his seat, and for a while, silence stretched between them, the only sounds coming from the television overhead and the occasional cough from the other patients. The hospital felt like a place suspended in time, a space where life was temporarily put on hold. Emma wasn't the type to start conversations with strangers, but there was something about him, something in the way he seemed to be wrestling with invisible demons, that made her speak. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, her voice soft, not wanting to startle him. Matthew glanced at her, his eyes bloodshot and tired. He hesitated, clearly not used to strangers asking after his well-being, especially in a place like this. But something in Emma's expression must have disarmed him, because after a long pause, he nodded, though the answer didn't seem truthful. "Yeah, just waiting for some news, I guess," he muttered, staring down at the styrofoam coffee cup in his hands. Emma nodded, sensing his reluctance but also recognizing the familiar walls he had built around himself. She had been there, locked in her own struggles, afraid to let anyone in. After a few minutes, he sighed as if giving in to the need to talk. "My father's in surgery," he said, his voice low and rough. "Heart attack. The doctors aren't sure if he's going to make it." Emma's heart sank. She hadn't expected that. The look in Matthew's eyes told her everything. This wasn't just any father-son relationship. It was complicated. "I'm really sorry," she said quietly, unsure of what else to offer. "I hope everything turns out all right." Matthew gave her a weak smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "It's complicated. My father and I, we didn't end on good terms." He shook his head as if pushing away the flood of painful memories. "I haven't spoken to him in years. Now, all of a sudden I'm here waiting to find out if he'll make it, and I don't even know if he'd want me here." Emma could hear the pain in his voice, the regret that laced his words. She could only imagine the guilt weighing on him, knowing there might be no time left to repair whatever had been broken between them. As they sat in silence again, Emma thought about how life had a cruel way of testing people in their weakest moments. She had seen it in her own family, in friends who had been ripped apart by circumstances beyond their control. It was in those moments, when everything seemed to be falling apart, that people either gave up or found a way to rebuild. A few more minutes passed before Matthew spoke again, this time more hesitant. "I know this might sound strange, but have you ever felt like you just ruined everything? Like no matter what you do, you can't fix the mess you've made?" The rawness in his voice startled her. It wasn't a question she expected to hear from a man like Matthew Bennett, someone who had been on top of the world at one point. But then again, maybe that was the point. He had been on top, and now he was sitting here in a hospital waiting room, his life reduced to a series of tragedies no one really knew about. Emma nodded slowly. "Yeah, I have. More than I'd like to admit, actually." For the first time, Matthew really looked at her. His eyes softened just a bit, as if finding a flicker of understanding in her words. They sat there for a long time, talking quietly, about his father, about the mistakes he had made, about the life he used to have and the one he didn't know how to rebuild. Emma listened, offering no judgment, just a quiet compassion that seemed to soothe some of the hurt he had been carrying. By the time the nurse finally called Matthew's name, he stood up slowly, as if the conversation had somehow lightened his load. He turned back to Emma and for the first time that evening, gave her a real smile, a small but genuine one. "Thanks," he said, his voice softer now. "I didn't realize I needed to talk to someone until now. I guess I just wanted someone to listen." Emma smiled back. "I'm glad I could help." As he walked away, she watched him go, feeling an odd sense of connection to this stranger. It wasn't love at first sight or anything out of a fairy tale, but there was something there, something real. She didn't know it then, but that rainy afternoon in a hospital waiting room would mark the beginning of a journey neither of them could have predicted. They had both been at the edge of something broken, but together they would find a way to rebuild, not just their lives but each other. And in that moment, as the door swung shut behind him, Emma had no idea that her path and Matthew Bennett's were about to become inseparable. 3 years had passed since that rainy day in the hospital, and the world around Matthew Bennett had transformed entirely. The broken man Emma had met in the hospital waiting room, who once wore the weight of the world on his shoulders, had become unrecognizable. He had clawed his way back from the depths of financial ruin, rebuilding his career brick by brick, and was now back at the helm of one of New York's most successful real estate companies. But the journey was far from glamorous. In fact, it had been anything but easy. As Emma stood at the edge of a charity gala, surrounded by New York's elite, she watched Matthew move confidently through the room. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his smile charming, his handshake firm. To everyone in that room he was the image of success, Matthew Bennett, the comeback king. They saw the story splashed across headlines, the rise from bankruptcy to billionaire. They saw the parties, the penthouse, and the dazzling woman at his side. But Emma knew better. She knew the sweat and sleepless nights, the endless deals and shattered hopes. Most of all, she knew the emotional toll it had taken on him, and on them. It hadn't taken long after their meeting at the hospital for Matthew and Emma to grow close. What had started as a quiet friendship, rooted in shared pain and understanding, had blossomed into something more. They spent long nights talking, first about their pasts and then about their futures. Matthew, scarred by his father's death and the fallout from his financial collapse, had been hesitant to trust anyone again. But Emma had been different. She wasn't interested in what he had lost or what he could become. She had seen him at his lowest, at a time when he was just a man trying to piece together his shattered life. And she had stayed even when everything else had fallen apart. As Matthew rebuilt his company, Emma was always there, supporting him in ways no one else saw. In the early days when the business was barely scraping by, it was Emma who encouraged him to keep going. She would sit with him late at night in their small apartment, poring over documents and financial statements, offering her quiet advice or simply listening as he vented about deals that had fallen through. The road to success was filled with more failures than victories in those early years. Matthew had to start from scratch, seeking out investors who were skeptical of his return to the industry. Many of the people who had once lined up to partner with him turned their backs, unwilling to risk their reputation on a man whose name had once been synonymous with failure. But slowly, and with Emma by his side, things began to turn. A few key investments paid off, and soon Matthew was closing deals that once again put him on the map. The press was quick to pick up on his comeback, labeling him the Phoenix of Wall Street. For a time, it seemed like everything was finally falling into place. Matthew's company grew, and so did his wealth. They moved out of their modest apartment into a sprawling penthouse in the Upper East Side. His face returned to magazine covers, not as the cautionary tale of a man who lost everything, but as a symbol of resilience. Yet, with that success came something else: scrutiny. As Matthew's fortune grew, so did the attention on their relationship. The people around them, business partners, investors, friends, even strangers, began to look at Emma with a different set of eyes. It started slowly at first. Little comments made at dinner parties, side glances at events. "Emma, you're so lucky landing a man like Matthew. Who wouldn't want to marry a billionaire?" A woman at a charity event had remarked with a sly smile, her glass of champagne raised in mock admiration. Emma had smiled back politely, feeling the first sting of judgment, but she had brushed it off. But it didn't stop there. As Matthew's name grew larger in the industry, so did the rumors. People began to question why Emma had stayed with him through the tough times. They speculated that she had always been waiting for his inevitable rise back to the top, that she had seen potential dollar signs in his future and stuck around just long enough to cash in. The whispers followed them wherever they went, growing louder with each passing month. Now, at this gala, surrounded by the city's wealthiest and most powerful, Emma could feel those whispers like a heavy cloud hanging over her. She caught snippets of conversations as she walked past groups of guests. She was there for the money. "You can tell, can't you?" She saw an opportunity and took it. One man whispered to his companion, their eyes flicking briefly to Emma before they quickly turned away. "Gold digger for sure. She wasn't with him when he had nothing. Just look at her. She's living the dream, isn't she?" Emma swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stand taller. She knew the truth, but the constant judgment was wearing her down. No one cared that she had loved Matthew long before the money came back. No one saw the nights she had spent by his side when he had nothing but a mountain of debt and a wounded heart. All they saw now was the glitz and glamour. As the evening wore on, Emma found herself on the terrace, staring out over the city skyline. The twinkling lights below looked beautiful from this height, but up close, the city was cold and unforgiving, just like the people in that ballroom behind her. Matthew joined her a few moments later, his smile fading as he saw the expression on her face. "Hey, what's wrong?" he asked softly, his hand resting on the small of her back. Emma shook her head, trying to hide the tears that threatened to spill over. "It's nothing," she lied. But Matthew knew better. He had seen how the whispers and the gossip had affected her over the past year. He had tried to shield her from it, but even he couldn't stop the relentless judgment that came with his newfound success. "Emma," he said, turning her to face him, "you know none of that matters, right? What they say, what they think, it's just noise. They don't know you. They don't know us." She looked into his eyes, her heart heavy. "It's not just noise, Matthew. They think I'm with you for the money. That's all anyone ever sees." Matthew's expression hardened. "They're wrong. And I don't care what they think. I know why you're here. I know you were with me when I had nothing, when the only thing I could offer you was me. And that's why I love you. Because you saw me for who I was, not for what I had." His words were sincere, but the truth was, no matter how much Matthew reassured her, the constant accusations were starting to take a toll on Emma. She had spent so long supporting him, building a life together through the hardest of times, only to be reduced to a stereotype. A woman who had married for wealth, not for love. She sighed, leaning her head against his shoulder as they watched the city below. "I just don't know how much longer I can keep pretending it doesn't hurt," she whispered. Matthew tightened his arms around her. "Then we'll fight it together. Whatever it takes, Emma, we'll get through it." But as they stood there, silhouetted against the bright lights of the city, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was only just beginning. The money, the success, it had come at a price. And as much as they loved each other, she wasn't sure love alone would be enough to silence the voices of doubt that surrounded them. The late autumn breeze swept through the New York City streets, carrying with it a chill that mirrored the growing tension in Emma's heart. From the outside, her life with Matthew looked picture-perfect. Penthouse views, black-tie events, and luxury vacations. But beneath the polished veneer of their world, Emma was slowly crumbling under the weight of something she had never revealed to anyone, not even Matthew. It was a secret she had buried deep, a sacrifice she had made without ever speaking the words aloud. The evening light was fading as Emma stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom, preparing for another event. Another night of pretending that everything was fine, that the world's judgment hadn't seeped into her bones. She adjusted her dress, running her fingers through her hair, but her eyes were distant, troubled. As she glanced at her reflection, she couldn't help but notice how tired she looked. The woman staring back at her seemed like a ghost of the person she once was. There were days when the accusations of being a gold digger, of marrying Matthew for his fortune, became almost too much to bear. But what made it worse, what made it truly unbearable, was the weight of the secret she carried alone. It had started shortly after Matthew's company began to rebound, around the time when the whispers about her intentions had grown louder. Emma had noticed small changes in her body, persistent fatigue, dizzy spells, and a strange lingering pain in her abdomen that wouldn't go away. She had assumed it was stress, the pressure of keeping up with the demands of Matthew's new life, but deep down she feared it was something more. A trip to the doctor had confirmed her worst fears. The words had echoed in her mind ever since. "It's ovarian cancer, Emma. Stage 2. We've caught it early, but you'll need treatment." Her whole world had stopped. She remembered sitting in the doctor's office, her heart pounding in her chest as he explained the next steps. Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. It was like listening to someone else's life being diagnosed, as if none of it could possibly be real. But it was real. And from that moment on, Emma had made a choice she would regret more than anything. She had decided not to tell Matthew. It wasn't because she didn't trust him. She loved him more than anything, and she knew he would drop everything to be by her side. But that was exactly the problem. Matthew was already under so much pressure. His business was still fragile, and the weight of their relationship being constantly scrutinized was enough to drive anyone to the edge. He had just started to rise from the ashes of his past, and Emma didn't want to be the reason he fell again. She didn't want to become another burden for him to carry. So she had made a painful, silent decision. She would fight this battle alone. "You ready?" Matthew's voice broke through her thoughts. He stood at the doorway, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored suit, his eyes soft as they landed on her. Emma forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just give me a minute." Matthew crossed the room, taking her hand gently in his. His touch was warm, comforting. "You seem off tonight. Is everything okay?" For a second, Emma thought about telling him the truth. She could feel the words forming in her throat, the confession, the fear, the pain she had been hiding. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the strain he was already under. The last thing he needed was more worry, more weight on his shoulders. She couldn't do that to him. Not now. "I'm fine," she whispered, forcing herself to sound convincing. "Just a little tired, that's all." Matthew studied her for a moment longer, concern flickering across his face, but he didn't push. He leaned down and kissed her forehead softly, his lips lingering there for just a moment. "We'll leave whenever you're ready," he said quietly before turning to leave. Emma watched him go, her heart aching. She hated lying to him. But in her mind, she was protecting him, sparing him from the darkness that had settled over her life. She would tell him eventually, she just needed more time. Time to figure out how to fight this without dragging him down with her. The gala that evening was grand, filled with the usual crowd of New York's elite. Emma moved through the ballroom like a ghost, smiling at the right moments, laughing politely when required, but her mind was elsewhere. The room buzzed with conversation, but all Emma could hear was the pounding of her own heart, the ever-present reminder of the ticking clock she was racing against. As they stood at the edge of the crowd, Matthew's business partner, Daniel, approached them. He was one of the few people who had been loyal to Matthew during the hardest years, and his sharp eye for investments had helped save Matthew's company from complete ruin. "Emma, you look stunning as always," Daniel said, his smile wide but with an undercurrent of formality. "Matthew, a word? I think we need to talk about the Peterson deal before Monday's meeting." Matthew nodded, glancing at Emma. "I'll just be a minute, okay?" Emma smiled and waved him off, grateful for the brief moment of solitude. She watched as the two men disappeared into a quieter corner of the room, but her reprieve didn't last long. Soon enough, a familiar voice slithered into her ear. "Enjoying the view from the top, Emma?" Emma turned to see Samantha Blackwell, one of the city's more notorious socialites, standing beside her. Samantha had been a thorn in Emma's side from the moment she and Matthew had started appearing at events like this one. While others whispered behind Emma's back, Samantha made no effort to hide her contempt. "You must be so proud," Samantha continued, her voice dripping with venom. "Landing a man like Matthew. It's not easy, holding on to someone like him, especially when the money's rolling in." But I guess you know that better than anyone, don't you? Emma felt the familiar sting of Samantha's words, but she stayed calm. She had gotten good at ignoring the insults, at pretending they didn't hurt. Matthew and I are happy, Samantha. That's all that matters. Samantha raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smirk. For now, maybe. But trust me, darling, when the money is involved, happiness is never enough. Emma's hand tightened around her glass. She wanted to snap back to put Samantha in her place, but what was the point? It wasn't worth the energy. But what Samantha couldn't see, what no one in that room could see, was the real battle Emma was fighting. It wasn't about proving she loved Matthew or that their relationship was built on more than wealth. It wasn't about surviving the gossip or the judgment of people like Samantha. No, the real fight was happening inside her own body, silently, relentlessly. And every day, Emma felt herself growing weaker. Later that night, after the gala had ended and they had returned home, Emma lay in bed beside Matthew, listening to the sound of his breathing as he slept. She stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing. The pain in her abdomen was getting worse. Every night, it became harder to ignore, harder to pretend that everything was fine. She had been putting off treatment, delaying the surgery the doctors had recommended, hoping she could hold out just a little longer. But the truth was catching up to her, faster than she had expected. She turned to look at Matthew, his face peaceful in the dim light. He was everything to her, her strength, her heart, her home. And yet, she was keeping this enormous secret from him, a secret that could destroy everything they had built. Tears filled her eyes as she reached out and gently touched his hand. She loved him so much, but she couldn't burden him with this, not yet. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Emma closed her eyes, her body racked with silent sobs. She didn't know how much longer she could keep this up. The secrets, the lies, the sacrifices, it was all becoming too much. And deep down she knew that soon, very soon, the truth would come out. But when it did, she feared it might be too late to save them. The wind whipped fiercely through the New York streets, a biting cold that cut through the city like the tension brewing between Emma and Matthew. Inside their luxurious penthouse, the warmth of the crackling fireplace did little to soothe the growing distance between them. For weeks, there had been an unspoken tension, a widening gap neither could fully understand nor bridge. But tonight, all of that tension would erupt into something neither of them could control. Emma stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, her arms wrapped around her body as if shielding herself from the emotional storm brewing inside her. She stared out at the city lights twinkling in the distance, wondering how it had all come to this. How had she let things spiral so far? The secrets she had been keeping, the lies she had been telling herself, had finally caught up with her. Her body was getting weaker. The pain was more constant now, impossible to ignore. She knew she had to tell Matthew the truth, but every time she tried, the words stuck in her throat like thorns. Behind her, she heard the door to Matthew's office open, followed by his familiar heavy footsteps as he crossed the room. "Emma, we need to talk." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Emma took a deep breath before turning to face him. She could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the worry in his eyes. He had been dealing with so much: his business, the constant media attention, and the relentless judgment about their relationship. And here she was, adding to that burden with her silence. "What is it?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. He had been trying to be patient, trying to understand why Emma had been so distant lately, but he was running out of explanations. He felt like he was losing her and he had no idea why. "I don't know what's going on with you, but something's not right," he said, his tone firm but pleading. "You've been pulling away for weeks, Emma. Every time I ask if something's wrong, you tell me you're fine, but you're not. I can see it. I can feel it. So please just tell me what's happening." Emma's heart twisted in her chest. She wanted to tell him, she really did. But every time she thought about it, about burdening him with her illness, with the reality of her diagnosis, fear took over. What if he couldn't handle it? What if it broke him? He had already been through so much. She couldn't be the reason he fell apart again. "I'm just tired, Matt," she lied, hating herself for it. "It's been a lot lately, with everything going on, the pressure, the rumors. I'm just tired." But Matthew wasn't buying it. He took a step closer, his frustration boiling over. "Tired? Emma, this is more than just being tired. You're not yourself. You're distant, distracted. You don't talk to me anymore. I feel like I'm losing you and I don't even know why." Emma swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. "I'm not pulling away, Then what is it?" Matthew interrupted, his voice rising. "Why won't you let me in? Why can't you just tell me what's really going on?" The words were hanging there, so close to the surface, but Emma couldn't bring herself to say them. The weight of her secret was suffocating, and the longer she kept it, the more it pushed them apart. She turned away, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But Matthew wasn't finished. His frustration was mixed with hurt now, a deep wound that Emma's silence had carved into him. "You know what I keep hearing everywhere I go? That you married me for the money. That all you care about is the life I can give you." His voice broke, emotion flooding into his words. "And I know it's not true, I know you, Emma. But when you shut me out like this, it makes me question everything. Why won't you talk to me? Why won't you let me help you?" Emma flinched at his words, the truth of what he was saying slicing through her. She could see the pain in his eyes, the doubt creeping in, and it broke her heart. This was her fault. She had done this by keeping him in the dark, by thinking she could handle it all on her own. "It's not about the money, Matthew. You know that," Emma said, her voice trembling. She could feel herself crumbling, the wall she had built to protect him and herself finally starting to break. "Then what is it?" Matthew demanded, his voice quieter now, filled with desperation. "What are you hiding from me, Emma? Please, just tell me." Emma's chest tightened. The words were on the tip of her tongue, ready to spill out, but fear held them back. She had spent months convincing herself that she was protecting him by keeping her illness a secret. But the truth was, she was terrified of what it would do to him, to their relationship, to the life they had built together. But Matthew deserved to know. He deserved the truth even if it shattered everything. Emma's voice wavered as she struggled to find the courage to say it. "There's something I haven't told you." Matthew's face softened as he took another step closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "Emma, whatever it is, we'll get through it. Just tell me." Emma's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she thought she might actually be able to say it. But then the fear overwhelmed her again. She couldn't do it. Not yet. Not tonight. She pulled away from his touch, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, her voice breaking. "I can't do this right now." Matthew's expression shifted from confusion to hurt, and then to something darker, something like resignation. He stared at her for a long moment as if trying to understand what had just happened, but the truth eluded him. Finally he stepped back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You don't trust me, do you?" he asked quietly, his voice hollow. "After everything we've been through, you still don't trust me enough to let me in." "It's not that," Emma protested, but the words sounded weak even to her own ears. She knew he was right. By keeping her illness a secret, she had created a rift between them that might never fully heal. Matthew shook his head, his jaw tight with emotion. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Emma. I feel like I'm fighting for us alone." Emma's heart clenched painfully at his words. She had pushed him too far, and now she was watching the man she loved slip away. "I don't want to lose you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew's eyes met hers, filled with sadness. "Then stop pushing me away." That night, Emma lay awake, the weight of her secret pressing down on her chest like a boulder. She could feel the distance between her and Matthew growing with every passing moment. She had never felt so alone, even lying beside him in bed. The truth was suffocating her, but she was still too afraid to let it out. Too afraid of what it would do to them. Too afraid of losing him. But deep down, Emma knew that by keeping her illness a secret, she was already losing him. And if she didn't find the courage to tell him soon, she might lose him forever. Morning light streamed through the curtains, casting soft golden hues across the room. Emma lay awake in bed, her heart heavy, the weight of the previous night still pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. Beside her, Matthew slept, his face peaceful in the quiet of the morning. But Emma knew better. That peace was fragile, a delicate mask that would shatter the moment he woke and remembered the wall between them. She had come so close to telling him. The words had nearly escaped her lips. But fear, her constant companion these last few months, had gripped her at the last second, pulling her back into silence. But she couldn't stay silent any longer. It was time. Emma sat up slowly, her body aching in ways that weren't just physical. The cancer had taken more from her than just her strength. It had stolen her ability to be honest with the man she loved, the man she had sworn to build a life with. And in trying to protect him, she had nearly destroyed them both. She glanced at the clock. It was still early, the city below just beginning to stir to life. There was time. She wouldn't wait any longer. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. Matthew stirred beside her, blinking awake as the sunlight hit his eyes. He stretched, his expression soft at first, until his eyes landed on Emma, sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to him, shoulders hunched under the weight of the secret she could no longer keep. "Emma?" he said, his voice thick with sleep but laced with concern. She turned slowly to face him, her heart pounding. This was it. The moment she had been dreading for months. But as she looked into his eyes, those eyes that had always seen her, truly seen her, even when the rest of the world refused to, she knew she couldn't hide any longer. "Matthew, there's something I need to tell you," she whispered, her voice shaking. His brow furrowed in confusion, but he sat up, reaching out to take her hand. "What is it?" he asked softly. "What's been going on?" Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the hardest thing she had ever done, but there was no turning back. "I've been lying to you," she began, her voice trembling. "Not just to you but to myself too. For months. And I'm so sorry, Matt. I never wanted to hurt you, but I thought I was protecting you. I thought I could handle it on my own." Matthew's expression shifted from confusion to worry. "Handle what? Emma, what are you talking about?" Tears filled her eyes as she finally spoke the words she had been holding back for so long. "I'm sick, Matthew. I've been sick for a while now." Matthew's face paled, his eyes widening in shock. "What? What do you mean you're sick?" Emma's voice cracked as the dam of emotion she had been holding back broke. "I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer a few months ago. It's stage 2. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to add to everything you've already been dealing with. I didn't want to be a burden." Matthew froze, his mind reeling, the words barely making sense to him. "Cancer? Emma?" The woman who had been his rock, who had stood by him through the darkest times, she was the one suffering and he hadn't even known. For a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. He just stared at her, the realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. "Emma, why didn't you tell me?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "How could you keep this from me?" Emma sobbed, unable to hold it back any longer. "I didn't want you to worry, Matt. You've already been through so much. You've worked so hard to rebuild everything and I didn't want to drag you down. I thought I could handle it, but I can't. I can't do it alone anymore." Tears filled Matthew's eyes as he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. "You're not alone, Emma. You were never alone. I don't care about the business or the money or what people say. None of that matters. You matter." Emma sobbed into his chest, her body shaking with the release of months of fear and pain. For so long she had carried this burden in silence, convinced that telling Matthew would break him. But in this moment as he held her, she realized how wrong she had been. Matthew wasn't breaking. If anything, he was stronger than ever, and his strength wrapped around her like a lifeline, pulling her out of the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, Matthew pulled back slightly, cupping her face in his hands. "We'll get through this, Em. Whatever it takes, we'll fight it. Together." Emma nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and guilt. "I should have told you sooner," she whispered. "I was so afraid." Matthew pressed his forehead to hers, his voice firm but gentle. "We don't have to be afraid anymore. Not of this, not of anything. We'll get through it. I'll be with you every step of the way." They sat there for a while, holding each other, the weight of the truth finally out in the open. It wasn't just the cancer that had been eating away at Emma, it was the silence, the loneliness of carrying such a heavy burden on her own. But now, with Matthew beside her, she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. The following weeks were a whirlwind of doctor's appointments, treatment plans, and difficult conversations. Emma underwent surgery, followed by rounds of chemotherapy. It was grueling, draining every ounce of energy from her body, but through it all, Matthew was there. He never left her side, holding her hand through the darkest moments, reminding her every day that she was stronger than she knew. The media continued to speculate about their relationship, the whispers of her being a gold digger still circulating among the elite. But neither Emma nor Matthew cared anymore. The world's opinion didn't matter, not when they were fighting for something so much bigger. As Emma's treatment progressed, her health slowly began to improve. The chemotherapy took its toll, but the doctors were hopeful. And for the first time in months, Emma allowed herself to hope too. One evening, after another long day of treatment, Matthew surprised her with a quiet dinner at home. They sat by the window, looking out at the city they had built their lives in, the same city that had once judged them so harshly. But tonight, none of that mattered. Matthew took her hand, his eyes filled with love and determination. "You saved me once, Emma, when I was at my lowest. Now it's my turn. I'll fight for you just like you fought for me." Emma smiled, tears filling her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude, of love. "I don't deserve you," she whispered. Matthew shook his head, gently lifting her hand to his lips. "You deserve everything, Em. You always have." In that moment, Emma realized something she had long forgotten. It wasn't the money or the success, or even the judgment of others that defined their love. It was the sacrifices they made for each other, the battles they fought side by side, the truth that bound them together. And no matter what came next, whether the world continued to misunderstand them or the road ahead proved difficult, they would face it together. Because in the end, their love was stronger than any storm, any judgment, any secret. It had always been. And it always would be. Months later, Emma stood by the same window, the city lights twinkling below. The treatment had been successful, she was in remission. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she and Matthew were stronger than ever. As she watched the city below, she felt Matthew's arms wrap around her from behind. He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice soft in her ear. "I love you, Emma." She smiled, leaning into him. "I love you too." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma felt at peace.